Hey everybody, Wheelchair Gunfighter here, White Rabbit Protection Strategies. First of all, I apologize for the huge gap in released content. I have way too many irons and way too many fires, so a lot of stuff has not been updated in a long time. I'm going to try to update stuff when I have time. I'm going to try to make time for it, but we will see how that goes. I feel there are some things I really want to prioritize updating because it just the number of people who send me emails asking about, in particular, wheelchair-related self-defense and gear-related issues has just skyrocketed. So it's easier to document some of my general thoughts than to type it all out in an email every single time. So that's what this one will be about. For those interested, this is a B.G. Meyer standard issue. Some people ask what I smoke. So this video will be particularly about wheelchairs, concealed carry, and the handguns that I carry. When it comes to specific gear, nothing I say, even by my own reckoning, what I say is, thus speaketh the Lord. Anything that I say is, thus thinketh Jake. So, a lot of it is my opinion, my experience. I'm pretty well plugged in to what other instructors are doing, and I pay attention a lot to what higher end instructors are doing. They put all that information out there, so I am loath to put out a piece of information that's in contradiction to that. I'm not going to say, well, in my, albeit if it's in that realm, lesser experience than someone else, and that contradicts something that someone says where they have 500,000 rounds of experience. Obviously, I'm going to err on the side of maybe mine's a smaller sample size. I generally haven't seen that. I still put a lot of rounds through stuff, so if that's the case, if there's a limited example somewhere, I will point that out. Okay, so general thoughts on wheelchair self-defense as far as firearms go. I'm not going to get a lot into specifics for me. If I do, I will say this is for me, or this is probably more geared towards amputees, because I recognize that there's a huge gap between wheelchair users. I've said this a million times. There's a huge gap in different wheelchair types. That matters. It all matters. So there's things that I'm going to be able to do that a SCI, a spinal cord injury, someone who runs a wheelchair with a spinal cord injury is not going to be able to do. I'm not going to lay what I do on somebody else. This is what I think. That said, I try to use a bunch of different stuff, both concealment gear and different types of pistols, and play with a whole bunch of different options, different carry options stuff, to try to see what works and what doesn't, purely from an upper body access perspective and from a mobility hindrance perspective. Those two general categories alone. There's a whole lot of nuance to this, but at least if we can hit the major categories, it gives someone a starting point, and you can go experiment for yourself. So, major considerations. One is that regardless of what handgun you're going to carry and how you carry it, provided you have full access of both hands. Obviously, I have a hand injury, but I can still shoot with this hand. Being right-handed, I learned to draw with my left hand because this is more dexterous. Obviously, I have better crush grip on this hand, and I have no nerve damage on the hand compared to this. So I can shoot with this hand, but I've learned to draw with this hand because I have better first shot control. But I highly emphasize, if you can, learn to use both eyes to shoot equally and both hands equally. So when you come up for the draw, maybe being able to switch hands. Here's the reason. This one's cleaver. For point of reference, anybody's going to get in the comments and throw a hissy fit about safe directions. For where I'm at right now, every direction is a safe direction except for that one. People are that direction. Everything else is a safe direction for where I'm at. For a wheelchair perspective, obviously mobility hindrance, sudden recognition of threat, physically turning my wheelchair to face a threat is going to be way slower than turning my upper body to face a threat. So if I'm right-handed and I'm drawing, I can punch out this way. If I'm dealing with a closer threat, I might want to shoot more compressed. I might do something more like this. Having the option is what's important. You don't know what you're going to be called to do. So by that same perspective, if I'm drawing with a left hand and I have to fire strong side this way, I can kind of get do something of a modified Harry's in this direction, or I can get a full extension one arm this way. Or if you're like some people who remove their brakes off their wheelchair, you've got to stabilize yourself with one hand. You're kind of stuck firing with one hand. But regardless, the point is, I might have to shoot in a weird position rather than turn my wheelchair all the way around. So I might have to shoot from some kind of center axis relock, like modified, super compressed, weird position with my left hand and my right eye, or my left hand and my left eye, despite me being right hand dominant. So what I'm saying is that it may be way faster, depending on the circumstances, to shoot with my off hand, if you want to call it that, and my off eye, depending on what kind of weird situation I find myself where I've got to put my gun into the fight really fast and I don't have time to turn my wheelchair into it. It might not even be a time issue. It might not even be a timing issue. It might be I'm on a slope. It might be my wheelchair's stuck. I start to move and it's kind of chalked by the environment. The wheels are stuck. There's a million circumstances where I can't turn my wheelchair specifically to face the threat and get a full double arm extension, isosceles-like upper body position. So just bear in mind that really to get the full potential out of wheelchair shooting from the wheelchair as a platform, being able to shoot with both hands and being able to shoot from a compressed position comfortably, your eyes being able to track your sights, maybe even from a more compressed position, could be a major consideration. So that's one of the primary considerations. As far as concealment goes, this is probably the one that comes up the most, and it's probably the least answerable, because body types are so different. But there's some things that I can say conclusively. I can say almost 100% of the time, or I can say 100% of the time, that it is the better decision, regardless, to not carry your only means of protection attached to your wheelchair. The reason for this is that most violent encounters, all of them that I've been able to find video footage of or record of, that started off with hands on the person. There are incidents involved where there was a more distance involved with an active gunfight. The person stayed seated. I've found a few of those, but whenever an ambush started within conversation distance, the first thing that happened is the wheelchair user gets ripped out of his wheelchair. If your gun is attached to the wheelchair in a bag in the wheelchair or mounted to the frame of the wheelchair of any kind, you are likely to get separated from it. Good luck getting back to the gun. Could you? Maybe. I would not bet on it. Having a secondary there, having a larger gun there, having maybe your small primary, or having your secondary but a smaller gun on your body somewhere, I have to say that is by far the biggest thing that has to be emphasized. That's really good. So have a gun on your body. Want a secondary on the chair? Cool. Now, carrying on your body, I recognize that, you know, sitting on the gun rubbing against your body, especially if you have severe nerve damage, spinal cord injury, it can cause bruising or sores or something like that. Something you have to work with respect to. I get that. There are more comfortable options carrying up on the chest and something more of an Alaskan rig. Good luck concealing that. People do it somehow. Some kind of modified Alaskan that's not quite shoulder carry, something that's down here, lower. It works. Fanny pack carry, this is where this really comes in. Shoulder carry, it works. If you're not worried about your hands hitting it as you're working the wheelchair, it works. I do shoulder carry. I've got a Kydex shoulder rig from Gunfighters Inc. I typically use that more in the wintertime. That goes with a specific handgun that's also better in the wintertime. I'll explain why. That's really beneficial. I live in the country, so I throw my heavy jacket on, throw the shoulder rig on top of that. I can get up and go. I don't typically conceal that one, but that's an option for wheelchair access. Cross draw is one that works really well. That's not a conventional carry for more able-bodied people. They're harder holsters to find, but a lot of Kydex makers are willing. I've found are willing to make a custom holster of some kind. Adam Harris at Gunfighters Inc. Has made me several cross draw holsters for my CZs. They work great. But it sits in the body. It's not as much in the plane of this rocking motion if you're worried about moving your wheelchair. And so it works. I will sometimes do appendix carry if it doesn't hurt you. Sorry, dog's making noise. Ginger, lay down. Appendix can work. It's going to be more around your body type. You're sitting down all the time. The belly can get in the way. A fanny pack carry will do pretty much the same thing. I generally still do hip carry because I can, and also I do a lot of martial artsy stuff, do a lot of hand-to-hand self-defense stuff. What I have found is that when I'm getting in a grappling situation, someone lands on top of me, I often run into a problem with appendix carry getting jammed up. I'm unable to get it and still maintain control of my being in my wheelchair and someone on top of me. There are some techniques, if you have core control, of staying in your wheelchair some of the time if someone puts hands on you. I wouldn't say all the time, but there are things that work, and appendix carry hinders those from working for me. So I generally still stick with hip carry. That for me is generally what works best in most circumstances. Where the backing and the side of the side panel of the wheelchair come together, it makes a little 90-degree pocket where a handgun can sit, and the side guard and the backing is high enough where it conceals the pistol, where I don't need a cover garment most of the time. So that's really convenient too. It's concealed without having the extra stuff in the way. Okay. Now, pistols I've used, I've owned Glock. I don't currently own Glock. Sole reason I think they're ugly. They work great. I think most of the people who train with me carry Glock. It's fine. I just don't have any. The grip angle's too different. I carry a bunch of different stuff. The grip angle's too different for my personal, cross training for me to really be comfortable with it. I just don't care for them. If you carry it, it's fine. It works great. Stuff that I have that I don't generally carry all the time. I've got a PX4 that I don't have here right now. I keep that one's kind of a permanently anchored gun for a specific circumstance. but know that I really like the PX4, particularly if the safety's been modified to be a G-type, or if you buy it a G-type where it's decocker only. Big fan of the PX4. There's also ways you can make it, you can keep it running even more smoothly. But we can talk about tips and tricks for particular guns another time. My wife really likes the M&P line. I like it a lot too. It works really well. I carry it sometimes. This is kind of like my default training gun if I'm testing ammo. I don't know why. That's just kind of what I do. My backup is an M&P 9C, so I like it enough to carry it. But it works fine. I've never had any reliability problems with it. I have had some accuracy problems with it. That's why I replaced the barrel and the one I actually carry. Again, I live in the country, and I have had to take longer shots with a handgun at things like coyotes. So the longer precision shot's something I need. But for practical self-defense accuracy, it works fine. When I talked about the shoulder rig, so striker, hammer, yes, sure, yes. Cocked and locked, DASA, sure, yes, sure. But when I talk about the shoulder rig, this is the handgun I typically use in that shoulder rig. It's an FNX 45. No particular reason why the 45. That's just the caliber I got when I wanted to test this platform. I like it a lot. What I have really come to love is the extra large, where's the, it's on the bottom. I was looking for the, I didn't want to expose the serial number, but the extra large trigger guard. And this is why I favor hammer-fired guns, because if I'm using wheelchair gloves, I've noticed on Glock, some M&P triggers, that as I come onto the trigger with a glove, it will start to compress the trigger just from the material of the glove. So just trying to get my finger in the trigger guard will start to compress the trigger. And I was not comfortable with that. For most guns, I'm not comfortable with it. I have a modified trigger in the M&P Compact that I carry to avoid that. But then again, half the year I have fingerless gloves. So that's part of the consideration, but when it's cold out, I've got a full-fingered gloves, like I said. That shoulder rig can go over my jacket, and that extra large trigger guard, gloves are not even an issue, that and it being a hammer-fired gun. So this one's, for me, is really ideal for that purpose. Plus I can carry, cocked and locked, and I've got even more room in the trigger guard. But there's that. There's my guns, the guns that are just mine, that, those are the guns that work for me. Some people, it's just like, oh, Glock just shoots well for me. This works. The two of them I thought were some of the ugliest guns I'd ever seen when I first picked them up. That was the CZ75 and the Makarov. The CZ75, like, man, that's kind of an ugly looking, antiquated looking gun. I picked it up, and I'd pick a spot, kind of visualize a spot, I'd press out to it and then check my sight picture, kind of something of a free-handed natural point of aim type of thing. It's just a thing I do, and it's the only handgun I'd ever picked up where I just had perfect sight alignment on a mentally visualized target as I came up and checked it visually. And so my hands just naturally take to CZ, and they shoot really well for me. They're inherently accurate I think a lot of people would tell you that CZs are really accurate inherently anyway. But one of my favorite carry guns is the CZ SP01. And I've got several of them. They work really well for me. I get to carry it cocked and locked like a 1911, which I don't own anymore. It's one of my only regrets is selling the 1911, so I don't have that as an example to show. I don't have any problem with 1911s, at least well-made ones. But this is what really works for me. What it comes down to ultimately is functionality. though it shot really well for me. This is probably number 3 as far as overall reliability for me. Super reliable, but I fire lots of rounds through stuff, and of the guns that work best for me, this has had the most malfunctions. To be fair, I've also used more crap ammo in this, so it's not super fair comparison, but that's why this puts this at number 3 for my carry guns. The Makarov is number 2 solely because of reliability. Solely. Well, that's not true. And accuracy and concealability. So it's not just one thing. But this thing will just... I have 2 Makarovs that I've run horrendously. First ran into them in a foreign weapons armors course. Like, that's really ugly and inefficiently designed. I bet if I learned to fight with that, I could learn to fight with anything. And I end up falling in love with it. I don't know why. I still don't know why. I still think they're ugly. But they're stupid simple. The whole gun has like 19 parts down to every screw and spring. I have, I think, 40,000 rounds through 2 Makarovs, if I'm not mistaken. And I've never had a Makarov malfunction. Not one that wasn't deliberately induced with, you know, a empty casing intentionally for training purposes or something like that. I've never had an organic Makarov malfunction, ever. And maybe I just have the best luck in the world with them. But if it works for me, I'll take it. So, but they're small, they're relatively heavy, but they're small, easy to conceal, and they work. And they're stupid accurate. At least mine are. Can't speak for anyone else's guns. My go-to carry gun, however, though slightly less reliable in my experience, is the SIG P226. That's just my carry gun. I've had very few malfunctions with it. I think I have more rounds through this than I have any other single handgun that I own, or at least this model. And it just shoots really well for me. The grip angle is very close to what the CZ is for me, so they shoot very naturally for me. Very proven track record. I've owned a lot of different models of SIGs, and SIG's kind of one of those companies I can feel safe recommending just about anything from. I can't really say that safe from like Smith & Wesson. But the SIG is kind of what I go to. Now, modifications for wheelchair use. First and foremost, I should have said this at, concealment, as far as what is a major consideration with holsters. Retention is one of the staple points of a holster anyway. However, something to bear in mind is that very thing that I mentioned about being pulled out of the wheelchair, and that, let's assume that happens. Will the holster you're using keep the gun where you want it if someone rolled you out of your wheelchair, or is very forcefully tipped your chair over sideways, or in other words, turned the gun as it's attached to your body upside down and gave it a violent shake? Budget holsters are not going to do that. Something with a strap might, but just saying that is something that you really have to consider. I've never had a problem with high-end Kydex. But to be fair, some holsters I've gotten, I've taken a heat gun to and increased the retention in wherever the retention point was, whether it was the trigger guard or wherever. I've increased the tension. I don't mind pulling on it a little harder, knowing that it's going to stay there. And then I go test my gear. Like I said, I teach a lot of self-defense, and I do a lot of rolling around, so I had the opportunity to go test that. So somehow you need to test that, because that is, despite how unlikely it is to be in a self-defense situation anyway, if it's going to happen for you as a wheelchair user, it's probably going to look like that. So you have to look at your gear with respect to that. So if your holster isn't already like that, really try to look at a way of modifying it somehow where that won't be an issue. Obviously, something like fanny pack carry, it's enclosed, so maybe you have less of an issue with that, but bear that in mind. Modifications. So because there can be so many unorthodox shooting stances from the wheelchair, I've come to notice that a lot of wheelchair shooters, at least on the non-expert level, have had a lot of success with various recoil management devices. I like DPM's mechanical recoil reduction systems. Just about all the guns I've installed them in, they work really well. But when I hand it to another wheelchair shooter, they can notice a huge difference. So if they have some kind of dexterity issues, it's value added. Why not? If you can throw another $70 into the gun and you know it's going to increase your ability to put quick initial shots and quick follow-on shots on target, why not do it? So that's a big one. Sight modifications, another one. Like I said, you're shooting potentially from a compressed position, but you have different ranges that you have to commonly practice at. So having a sight system, and most people swap the sights on their gun anyway. And these are things people typically do with their guns. But what I'm saying is that the enhancement for a wheelchair shooter can be that much more. So swapping out the sights, do so with respect to when you get a new gun. Test those different firing positions. See how your eye takes to those sights. So in that regard, red dot sights on handguns, do it. Why not? Whatever it is your eye works best with, try stuff. See whatever your eye works with at different compressed shooting positions. How well does your eye pick those things up? But do it for that reason is my advice. You can say modifying the grip. So if you're talking about a polymer frame grip, different stippling jobs, the same argument can apply there. If you have some kind of dexterity issue, some odd way that you have to manipulate the gun, or some way that you have trouble applying pressure with your grip to maintain control of the gun as it's firing, that can be a consideration. Know that if you have a polymer frame gun, this can really be modified in a lot of ways to enhance your ability to hold on to it as you're firing it. So again, for that reason, consider that. Also consider you really mess with that grip, how it's going to ride against your body as you're basically leaning against it all day, depending on how it interacts with your wheelchair. So two-way street, is that really going to mess your clothing and your potentially your skin up if it's riding against your body? Is it not? Consider it. Weapon-mounted lights on carry guns have really grown on me from the wheelchair perspective too. I had some stuff I was playing with, but I finally just started doing it full time. You saw it on my SIG. The main reason for that, again, is one-handed shooting. If you've got to control your wheelchair with one hand and you can only fire with, you've got to control your wheelchair with one hand, you can only fire with one hand, being able to manipulate a light with a second hand may not be an option, so it's just, again, value added. Threat identification and that element of surprise if you know how to use a light correctly. So, and these are not things that people aren't doing to handguns already, but these are the things I've run into with wheelchair shooters who are in a wheelchair or new to shooting. These things can get in the way, and there are modifications out there. There are things you can do to your gear that can overcome a lot of those natural inherent problems that you have learning to shoot for defensive purposes. So recognize what your platform is. Your upper body is enough to mitigate the recoil. So it's what you're doing with your arms that are going to give you the position that you're going to have to shoot. Try it from, if your local range allows, turn yourself sideways and fire downrange that way. Or if you can't, you can shimmy more around. it's going to be if, you know, whether or not your range allows it. But try to do those different things, at least with an empty handgun. See how your eye interacts, how your body interacts with the gun as you're are able to just move, try to pivot your torso in place without turning your wheelchair. Because that's going to be a large number of those scenarios. So the main thing is how you interact with a handgun as you're pivoting back and forth. Everything else is value added. But those are the major considerations I have for wheelchair concealed carry. The email is the same, wheelchairgunfighter@gmail.com. Get a hold of me if I didn't mention anything of any of the major points that you guys have brought up before. And I'm going to try to put out more of these. I'm not making any promises. But thanks. I'll catch you guys later.